Welcome to the Criminal Imagination. This series, Crime and Civilization, begins with a simple question. What if the true purpose of law is not justice but control? Across centuries, crime fiction has recorded the political fears of its age, from cursed kings and cunning thieves to corrupt judges and silent witnesses. Each episode investigates how power operates through a narrative, what it hides, who it condemns, and what happens when the system turns inwards and begins to devour itself. What do you call a man raised in obscurity, educated in refinement, capable of quoting poetry and wielding a pistol with equal skill, yet destined to be hanged, a criminal, or a product of its time? In this episode, we learn that crime fiction isn't merely entertainment, it's an archaeological site of the modern state. Today, we turn to Edward Bulwer-Lytton's 1830 novel Paul Clifford, a work remembered mostly for its infamous opening line, "It was a dark and stormy night," but too often forgotten for the radical questions it dares to ask about class, crime, and the brutal illusions of justice. Today's episode centers on one of the most strangest, most iconic crime novels in the canon, Edward Bulwer-Lytton's Paul Clifford. You may know Bulwer-Lytton as the author of the infamous line, "It was a dark and stormy night," but behind the mockery lies a far more provocative insight. In Paul Clifford, published in 1830, Bulwer-Lytton created not only the prototype of the gentleman thief, he also crafted a savage critique of a society where legitimacy, morality, and even justice are doled out based not on action, but on ownership. Today's theme is the gentleman thief and the politics of respectability. We see it through the lens of capitalism and economic crime. We are drawing on thinkers like Karl Marx, E.P. Thompson, and Max Weber to argue that Paul Clifford is not a romantic tale about crime. It is a political novel, and a deeply ironic one at that. The novel opens not with a crime, but with an identity crisis. Paul Clifford is a child of uncertain birth, denied name, inheritance, and access to polite society. He is intelligent, elegant, articulate, everything a gentleman ought to be, and yet he is excluded. This exclusion is crucial. As Karl Marx would argue, the bourgeois order of the 19th century defines legitimacy through property. To have status, to wield power, to be considered moral, you must own, you must inherit, and you must possess. Paul Clifford has none of these, and so society refuses him the most basic political dignity, personhood under the law. Instead, he finds his advancement through theft, through the crime that mimics capital accumulation, but is punished because it lacks a charter of legitimacy. We tend to think of crime as a rupture in the social fabric, but in Paul Clifford, crime is the very logic of that fabric, only stripped of its political costume. What the aristocracy calls investment, Paul performs as a highway robbery. What the middle class calls entrepreneurship, Paul enacts with pistol and disguise. This is not a tale of moral collapse, it is a tale of structural contradiction. In early capitalist England, the route to mobility is closed to those who lack capital, but theft opens a mirror path, equally exploitative, equally structured by power. And this is where Bulwer-Lytton's genius becomes apparent. He does not romanticize Paul's criminality. He renders it absurd, even comic. But he also makes clear that Paul's crime is no different, in function or in effect, from the legitimate methods of wealth accumulation practiced by his social betters. As E.P. Thompson might say, this is a moral economy turned upside down. The great irony of Paul Clifford lies in the protagonist's dual identity. Paul is not a crude thief, he is a cultivated gentleman, well read and well dressed. He converses in salons and plans his crimes with surgical precision. He is, in a word, respectable until he is caught. This duality reveals the novel's central thesis: respectability is not a virtue, it is a costume. Max Weber famously wrote about the rationalization of economic life under capitalism. With the of the Protestant work ethic came a new moral code, one that linked outward behavior with inward salvation. But Bulwer-Lytton shows us the inverse. Paul Clifford behaves like a gentleman, but because he lacks the right kind of capital, society brands him a criminal. This is the true horror of respectability. It operates through exclusion. It declares who may speak, who may pass, who may live without surveillance. Paul violates that order not by being violent, but by being successful without permission. And so we see the state punishes not merely action, but audacity. Paul's crime is not theft, it is mimicry. He mimics the movements, the manners, and the morality of the elite, and that in a class bound world is unforgivable. In capitalism, Bulwer-Lytton seems to whisper, theft is crime only when poor do it. Nowhere in this hypocrisy more apparent than the courtroom scenes of Paul Clifford. When Paul is finally apprehended and brought to trial, the machinery of justice grinds into motion, not to discover truth, but to perform order. Here we can turn to Marx again. The state is not a neutral arbiter, it is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Its function is to protect property, not persons. And so Paul's eloquence, his intelligence, his very personhood becomes irrelevant. He has violated the sanctity of property and must be punished. E. P. Thompson would remind us here that law in England has always served a double purpose: to discipline the working poor and to reinforce the moral authority of the elite. Paul's trial is not about what he did, it is about what he represents. This is why Bulwer-Lytton insists on melodrama. The judge is severe, the witnesses exaggerated, the moral pronouncements absurd. Justice in Paul Clifford is not delivered, it is performed, and it is always a tragedy. If Paul Clifford is a criminal, then what do we call the wealthy merchants who enclose common lands, exploit tenant labor, and hoard rents? That is the quiet question humming beneath the narrative. It is not asked aloud, but it is performed. Bulwer-Lytton places Paul beside his social betters in drawing rooms, at public events, in prisons, and finally in court. What we see is not a difference of a character, but a difference of permission. Paul is entrepreneurial. He gathers networks, he organizes gangs, he distributes wealth, and crucially, he believes in merit. What separates Paul from the respectable capitalist is not action, but access. He does not own land, he does not sit in parliament, he does not inherit shares in the East India Company, and so his activities are not coded as innovation but as deviance. This is the heart of the economic critique. The mechanisms of capitalism, risk, speculation, opportunism, are the same across all classes, but the meanings assigned to them shift depending on who performs them. Where the banker speculates, the thief gambles. Where the gentleman hoards, the pauper steals. Where the investor buys influence, the criminal bribes. All terms for the same structure: extraction without consent. Paul Clifford does not expose the system as broken, he reveals that it functions perfectly. It punishes those who stimulate wealth without the legitimacy of ownership. Bulwer-Lytton also raises a deeply unsettling question: can morality survive economic precarity? Paul is not immoral, he does not enjoy hurting others. He is loyal to his friends, he is often horrified by the world he inhabits. But moral choice presumes freedom, and Paul, lacking education, wealth, and support, is denied that freedom from the start. Here Bulwer-Lytton anticipates what Marx would later call false consciousness. The idea that ideology is not chosen but inherited as the only available frame for survival. We see Paul waver throughout the novel, dreaming of reform, of a legitimate life, of bourgeois stability. But the barriers are too high. Without capital, there is no escape. Without legitimacy, even success becomes a threat. In such a system, morality is a luxury good. It is not demanded of the elite, it is assumed. And when the poor try to claim it, they are treated as pretenders. The novel then does not excuse Paul's crimes. It asks what alternatives he truly ever had. It is important to remember that Paul wants to be respectable. He is not a revolutionary. He does not want to burn the system. He wants to join it. This is where Bulwer-Lytton moves beyond satire into tragic irony. Paul spends the novel seeking legitimacy through love, through performance, through upward mobility. He studies, he mimics, he yearns. And when he falls in love with Lucy, he sees in her the true possibility of a future beyond crime. Love here becomes a stand in for legitimacy, the promise that one's soul might be recognized as worthy regardless of background. But Paul cannot hold both identities. To be a gentleman, he must erase his criminal self, and the system will not allow that erasure. This is the cruelty of respectability. It's seductive, aspirational, and always conditional. It must be earned in public, but it is revoked in private. It invites entry only to demand proof of bloodline. Respectability in Bulwer-Lytton's hands is a trap. It lures the outsider in and then destroys him for believing he ever belonged. In the final pages, Paul is revealed to be the long-lost son of the very judge who sentences him. The courtroom becomes a space not of justice but of recognition, but it comes too late. This moment crystallizes the novel's deepest theme. The law does not merely punish crime, it produces it. Had Paul known his father, had he been raised within the bounds of legitimacy, he might have become a magistrate himself. Instead, the absence of that lineage cast him into the criminal class, a category from which no elegance or intelligence could save him. This is not melodrama for its own sake. It is a structural critique. The law creates the very deviance it claims to eliminate, by drawing its borders too narrowly, by making justice conditional on name, inheritance, and decorum. In this light, Paul's fate is not an accident. It is the logical conclusion of a world with justice has been absorbed by economics. In Courtroom, in Paul Clifford, it is not a space of moral reckoning, it is a stage for tragic recognition, where the father and son meet not as kin but as a judge and convict. Let us return finally to Marx. Marx argued that under capitalism, the state exists to protect the conditions of capital accumulation, labor discipline, property rights, debt enforcement. Crime in this context is not a social failure. It is a category invented to safeguard economic order. Paul Clifford is capitalism's necessary enemy, not because he threatens its survival, but because he mirrors its logic too well. His crimes are calculated, efficient, and profitable. His organization is rational, his motivations are understandable. He is not chaos, he is not madness, he is a reason misapplied. Capitalism without a permit. This is what makes him dangerous. He reminds us that the criminal subject is not an alien, it is familiar. Paul is not the other, he is the same, denied a seat at the table. And this is the ultimate irony in Paul Clifford. It reveals that the capitalist state needs crime not to solve it, but to define itself against it. In capitalism, the novel seems to say crime is not the opposite of order, it is the mirror. So, where does that leave us? Paul Clifford is a strange novel, uneven in tone, riddled with irony, excessive with emotion. But beneath the surface lies a devastating insight. In the age of capitalism, the boundary between respectability and criminality is not moral, it is economic. Bulwer-Lytton's gentleman thief is not a contradiction, he is the system laid bare. And the question he leaves us with one is that we must still ask today, what does it mean to be a criminal in a world where only the wealthy can afford innocence? Try to answer it in the comments. Until next time, stay critical, stay curious, and remember, every courtroom is also a stage and every crime novel is also a mirror.